A judge publicly humiliates a retired Navy SEAL. His ruthless response goes viral. In a small town overshadowed by powerful interests, one retired Navy SEAL faced public humiliation in a courtroom, only to respond with a quiet strength that would soon go viral. This isn't just a story about conflict or revenge. It's about resilience, honor, and the unyielding spirit of those who serve quietly, often forgotten by the world around them. As you watch this journey unfold, you'll witness how true courage isn't loud. It's steady, dignified, and deeply emotional. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now let's jump in. In the town of Millstone, mornings moved slowly. The salt air hung heavy over cracked sidewalks, and the courthouse bell rang on schedule, though few paused to notice. Among those who did was a man most people overlooked, a retired Navy SEAL named Sam Rourke. To the townsfolk, Sam was just the quiet man who owned the old bait shop near the pier. His hair was gray now, his steps careful but deliberate. He lived alone, spent his evenings mending nets, and was always the first to raise the flag outside his shop each dawn. No one really asked about his past. Most assumed he was just another forgotten old man watching the tides. But if you watched closely, there were hints, faded scars that lined his hands, a precision in how he tied even the simplest knot, and the way his gaze seemed to track every movement in a room without effort. Beneath his worn jacket, he carried stories few could imagine. Sam's days were simple. He took care of his granddaughter, Emily, whenever his daughter, Claire, had to work late at the local diner. His bond with Emily was quiet but unbreakable. They shared silent walks along the shore, feeding seagulls and combing for shells, their conversations often held in soft glances rather than words. But something was changing in Millstone. A wealthy developer named Richard Vance had set his sights on the waterfront. His promises of luxury hotels and modern shops stirred the town council. The project would erase places like Sam's bait shop, the old docks, and the park where veterans gathered on Sundays. Sam had attended every town meeting about the project, sitting in the back, unnoticed. He didn't speak. He simply listened, his hand resting on a small, worn pocket notebook filled with dates, names, and quiet observations. One morning, Sam received a notice, a summons to appear in court. Vance had filed a claim challenging the validity of Sam's property deed. It was a thinly veiled tactic to force him out. Claire was furious. Emily didn't understand why her favorite place might disappear. But Sam remained steady. When the court date arrived, the room was packed. Townspeople, officials, and Vance's sharp-suited legal team filled the benches. At the front sat Judge Alan Mercer, a man known for his strict rulings and little patience for what he called sentimental nonsense. Sam sat quietly in the back row, his old cap folded in his lap. No lawyer, no witnesses, just him. Judge Mercer barely glanced at Sam before the proceedings began. "Mr. Rourke," Mercer said, his tone cold, "you've chosen to represent yourself. I strongly advise against it." Sam's response was a simple nod. What followed was a slow, public dismantling of Sam's case. Mercer dismissed his weathered documents as outdated. Vance's lawyers painted him as a stubborn relic, clinging to a shack that no longer mattered. Mercer's final remarks would linger like salt in an open wound. "You're just an old man sitting on borrowed land," he said, his voice sharp and public. "This town needs to move forward. It's time you step aside." The courtroom laughed quietly, some in pity, others in contempt. Sam simply gathered his papers, nodded once to the judge, and left. But what no one understood was that Sam had heard far worse in his life. And some storms don't make noise until they break. The walk from the courthouse to the pier was slow, deliberate. Sam's boots, worn thin but polished out of habit, scuffed against the pavement with each step. Emily trailed beside him, her small hand gripping his fingers tightly, her young mind still struggling to understand why people would want to take something that didn't belong to them. "Grandpa," she asked quietly, "are they going to take your shop?" Sam glanced down, his expression unreadable, though his thumb gently brushed across her knuckles in a silent reassurance. "We'll see, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady but distant. At home, Claire waited anxiously. She'd always known her father as a man who carried the weight of his memories with quiet grace. She knew bits and pieces of his past, but like many things with Sam, some doors stayed locked unless you were willing to sit in the silence long enough for them to open. When she asked how it went, Sam simply replied, "It's not over." But in truth, something inside him had been stirred. Not anger. Sam had seen enough of that in his time, but something deeper. A quiet refusal to let his life's corner of the world be erased by the greed of men who never knew sacrifice. That night, Sam sat at his kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed. In front of him lay a worn leather box he hadn't opened in years. His hand hovered over it for a long while before finally releasing the latch. Inside were fragments of a life most had forgotten. A trident pin from his SEAL days. A faded photograph of his team, some smiling, some lost to time. A folded letter from a commander long gone, its edges brittle. And at the bottom, a simple dog tag, edges dulled, numbers barely legible. Sam turned it over in his palm, his thumb brushing across the metal. Memories came, slow and heavy. The roar of helicopters. The taste of sand in his teeth. The names of brothers who never came home. But the past had never been a trophy for Sam. It was a duty he still carried. The next morning, he began moving with quiet purpose. He visited the county records office, not to argue, but to gather dates, files, archived maps. He spoke with old friends, men who had slipped into quiet lives just like him, their presence largely forgotten by a town eager to pave over its own history. Each man he spoke to offered something, a detail, a connection, a document buried under decades of bureaucratic dust. Word of the courtroom humiliation spread across town, and so did quiet whispers. Some saw Sam as defeated. Others, those who watched carefully, noticed the subtle shift in his walk, the focus in his eyes, the way he'd begun to knot his shoelaces a little tighter. Even Judge Mercer, in the solitude of his chambers, brushed it off as a closed case. But storms don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they build quietly, gathering weight. And in Millstone, something was gathering. The following days moved with deceptive quiet. Sam's routine remained unchanged to those on the outside. Opening the bait shop at dawn, walking Emily to school, tending to the cracked wooden planks along the pier. But beneath the surface, pieces were aligning. Sam made calls on an old flip phone, numbers committed to memory but untouched for years. Some went unanswered. Some were disconnected. But a few, those that mattered, were still alive, still listening. One afternoon, Sam's call was answered by a voice that stopped him cold. "Sam Rourke? I thought you were dead." The voice belonged to Thomas Bear McKinney, a former SEAL teammate. Bear had settled 3 states over, running a small security business. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. "Still here," Sam said quietly. "Could use your help." There was no need for explanations. Bear's answer was immediate. "Where and when?" Sam offered a soft chuckle. "Not that kind of help. I need records. Land deeds. Anything that can't be bought with a briefcase." Bear's tone shifted, thoughtful now. "You're still fighting like it's Fallujah, huh?" Sam's voice lowered, the weight of it settling in the pause. "Just trying to keep what's mine." Within days, old teammates began surfacing, men Sam hadn't seen since the dust of battle. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were carpenters, teachers, truck drivers. Ordinary lives. But their respect for Sam hadn't faded with time. Each brought something, a connection, a document, a piece of the puzzle. And soon, the quiet men of Millstone, veterans who had faded into the fabric of the town, began to show up at Sam's shop. Some he knew by name, others by the weight of their walk. They brought coffee, shared stories in soft tones, and slowly, deliberately, began to stitch themselves together around Sam. What started as a man standing alone was no longer just his fight. At the next town council meeting, Sam returned, not in solitude this time, but with men who had fought wars the town had conveniently forgotten. They sat behind him, silent, steady, their eyes sharp and their postures upright. The council noticed. So did Vance. But Judge Mercer? He barely glanced at them. His mind was made. Mercer scheduled a final hearing, one last chance to dispute the property claim. Sam would have just 15 minutes to present new evidence before the decision became irreversible. Claire begged him to hire a lawyer. She was desperate, afraid the weight of the system would crush him. But Sam's reply was quiet and firm. "Sometimes, you stand alone so others don't have to." And Emily, with the simple clarity only children possess, asked him, Are you going to fight them, Grandpa? Sam knelt to meet her gaze, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. I already am. As the hearing approached, the town began to murmur. Some were curious, others skeptical. But beneath it all, a quiet current began to swell. Because in places like Millstone, people start to remember when they see one man refuse to bend. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was coming. The courthouse was fuller this time. The story had spread across Millstone like rain soaking into dry soil. About the retired Navy SEAL fighting to keep his shop, about the judge who'd humiliated him in public, and about the quiet gathering of men with similar eyes and steady hands now standing at his side. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they realized, too late, that they had let men like Sam fade into the background. Richard Vance arrived with the same sharp-suited legal team, smug in his certainty. His company banners already fluttered over construction sites in nearby towns. To him, this was a formality, a minor delay in a process he had already purchased. Judge Mercer entered with his usual clipped pace, robes crisp, gavel in hand. He didn't look at Sam as he called the room to order. 15 minutes, Mr. Rourke. Make them count. Sam stood, slowly, his presence quiet but undeniable. His jacket hung from his shoulders, its stitching frayed, but his movements were deliberate, controlled. He placed a small stack of files on the bench. Your Honor, I've gathered original deeds, notarized decades ago. Property lines, purchase orders, maintenance records, all tied to this land since my father's time. Mercer waved a hand dismissively. These have already been reviewed. Sam's eyes didn't waver. Not these. He slid forward a yellowed document. Its ink faded but still legible. This, Sam said, is a signed amendment from 1967, sealed by the county registrar. It designates my property as a protected veteran's holding, assigned for community and familial use in perpetuity. It was lost in the flood archives 30 years ago, but I found the registrar's daughter. She kept her father's ledger. The record survived. The courtroom fell silent. Vance's lawyers scrambled through papers, whispering urgently. Mercer's brow furrowed, the first crack in his practiced indifference. But Sam wasn't finished. He lifted another file, this one newer. Additionally, I've gathered community affidavits, business contracts, and dock restoration permits under my name, none of which were disclosed in the initial claim. Mercer's irritation flickered. You're not a lawyer, Mr. Rourke. Sam's gaze was calm. No, sir. I'm not. But I know how to fight for ground. There was no bluster, no theatrics, just quiet, immovable resolve. Bear McKinney rose from the bench, clearing his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Mercer hesitated but allowed it. I'm Thomas McKinney. I served with Mr. Rourke in Afghanistan. He's not the kind to draw lines without reason. But when he does, you'd best respect them. A murmur rippled through the crowd. More veterans stood. Some spoke briefly. Men who'd known Sam from deployments, from missions buried beneath layers of classification. They didn't speak of heroics. They spoke of integrity, sacrifice, the quiet way Sam carried others' burdens. Mercer shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable as the weight of testimony settled over him. Sam turned back to the judge, his voice steady. I didn't come here to win. I came here to remind you. Some ground isn't for sale. Some men don't move because they're stubborn. They stay because someone must. Vance's smirk had long vanished. The courtroom, once indifferent, now leaned into Sam's words. And though the gavel had yet to fall, the tide had turned. For the first time in his long tenure, Judge Mercer found himself uncharacteristically still. His fingers rested on the handle of the gavel, but he didn't lift it. The silence in the courtroom was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of reckoning. Mercer cleared his throat, his voice momentarily caught in the weight of what had just unfolded. Mr. Vance, he said, turning to the developer. Do you have anything to present in response? Vance's lead attorney stood, his confidence rattled but not yet broken. Your Honor, even if this document were admissible, which we would contest on procedural grounds, the practical benefit of the redevelopment far outweighs the preservation of a failing bait shop. Failing? Claire's voice cut through the room before she could stop herself. She stood, her hands trembling but her voice sharp with truth. That bait shop isn't just my father's. It's the last working dock for fishermen who can't afford your luxury slips. It's where veterans gather because nowhere else remembers them. My daughter learned to fish there. She learned to remember there. The room swelled with quiet support. The faces of the townsfolk, once neutral, now shifted. Some nodded. Others wiped at their eyes. Mercer leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Order," he said, though his voice had softened. Vance's lawyer pushed again, but each argument now felt brittle, forced. The community's presence, the veterans' solidarity, the clarity of Sam's evidence, it all carved into the legal facade Vance had built. Mercer reviewed the documents in front of him, his hand resting idly on the gavel as though its weight had grown heavier in his grasp. He looked at Sam, and for the first time, he really saw him. Not just the aging man in the back row, not just the stubborn shop owner, but the man who had drawn quiet lines in sand and stone across continents most would never set foot on. Mercer's voice dropped to a low, contemplative tone. "You could have hired a lawyer, Mr. Rourke." Sam's answer came without hesitation. "Some battles aren't for lawyers." Mercer's gaze faltered, just for a moment, before he turned to Vance. "Your claim is dismissed. The land stands. The shop stays. Case closed." The gavel came down, not with arrogance, but with something that almost sounded like respect. The courtroom released a collective breath. Vance spun on his heel and stormed out, his entourage scrambling behind him, the weight of their loss hanging in the air. But Sam didn't celebrate. He simply gathered his papers, placed his old cap back on his head, and turned to leave. As he passed Mercer's bench, the judge spoke softly, so softly only Sam could hear. "I was wrong about you." Sam paused at the door, his reply measured but firm. "People usually are." Outside, Emily ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. "Grandpa, you won." Sam placed his hand gently on her head. "I didn't win, sweetheart. We just didn't lose." The difference mattered. The veterans who had gathered followed him out, some clapping him on the shoulder, others offering nothing more than a nod, the kind of nod that says, "I see you. I remember." And as they stepped into the morning sun, it became clear. The shop was never just a building. It was memory. It was ground worth standing for. And in Millstone, it would remain. News of Sam's quiet stand spread beyond Millstone faster than anyone expected. At first, it was just murmurs among the local fishermen, then a few posts on social media from people who had been in the courtroom that day. But by the end of the week, the story had taken on a life of its own. Headlines appeared. Retired Navy SEAL defends bait shop against powerful developer. Judge publicly humiliates veteran, then is forced to reverse decision. A small town remembers its own. People across the country latched onto the story, not because of grand speeches or explosive courtroom drama, but because of what it represented. A man quietly defending what mattered, without rage, without spectacle, but with unwavering resolve. Local news crews camped near Sam's shop, eager for interviews. Reporters called, their questions leaning toward sensationalism. But Sam turned them all away. Claire fielded the calls, gently but firmly. "My father doesn't need headlines. He just wants his shop." Still, the story refused to die. Veterans organizations picked it up, and soon, handwritten letters began arriving at the shop. Notes from strangers, from fellow service members, from children who now wanted to know who Sam Rourke really was. Some sent photographs of their own fathers and grandfathers, standing in front of small, time-worn businesses just like Sam's. Others sent flags, medals, and tokens of gratitude. Sam read every letter. And though he never replied directly, he did something else. He began restoring the old benches along the pier, the ones where veterans used to gather but had long since fallen into disrepair. Bear McKinney returned to town, helping him quietly. Together, they sanded the wood, replaced bolts, scrubbed away the rust, and in soft conversation, drifted back to old memories. One afternoon, as they worked, Bear tapped the bench and smirked. "You know you went viral, right?" Sam didn't look up from his sanding. "Not interested." Bear shook his head. "World's not as quiet as it used to be, Sam." Sam's answer was almost a whisper. "Then we teach it to listen." The town council, sensing the shift in public sentiment, approved funds to preserve the waterfront, designating the area around Sam's shop as a heritage site. Other veterans in Millstone, once scattered, began returning to the Sunday gatherings. It wasn't just about Sam anymore. It was about remembering. Emily started to collect the small flags people sent. She planted them around the shop, one by one. until the weathered building was surrounded by tiny reminders that some ground is held with quiet hands. Claire watched her father from the porch one evening as he folded the flag at sunset. "You know, you could have walked away," she said softly. Sam's eyes stayed on the horizon, his voice low. "Some places don't belong to us. They belong to those who need to remember." The bait shop stood, not as a monument of defiance, but as a quiet promise. And though the reporters eventually drifted away, the ripples Sam had made continued to spread. Some battles are never loud, but they echo all the same. Weeks passed, and though the immediate storm had settled, the ripples continued to move outward, touching places and people Sam never expected to reach. One morning, as Sam and Emily opened the shop together, they found a small package resting against the door. No return address, just a simple note inside. "You taught me to stand my ground. Thank you." Inside the package was a folded American flag and an old seal trident pin, one that had clearly seen decades of wear. Sam didn't say anything. He simply placed the trident in a small glass case on the shop's back shelf, quietly honoring whoever had sent it. Over time, more small packages appeared. Medals, photographs, stories scribbled on the backs of grocery receipts. Each one was from someone who had seen his story, who had remembered something they thought they'd forgotten. But Sam didn't display them as trophies. He built a wooden memory wall in the back of the shop, carefully arranging each item like pieces of a mosaic. The wall wasn't for visitors. It wasn't a shrine. It was simply a place where the weight of other people's stories could rest alongside his own. Bear noticed it on one of his visits. "You're building something here, Sam." "Not building," Sam said, brushing dust from one of the frames. "Just making space." Claire, too, found herself pulled into something larger than she'd anticipated. The diner where she worked began filling with out-of-towners who'd come to see the man they'd read about. They wanted stories, but Sam offered none. "They can walk the pier," he'd say. "The stories and the planks." Emily, in her youthful honesty, didn't see her grandfather as a hero. To her, he was still the man who helped her bait hooks and fixed her bicycle with patient hands. But she noticed how strangers now looked at him with something new in their eyes. Respect. One afternoon, as they sat on the end of the dock, feet dangling over the water, Emily asked him, "Why didn't you tell people you were in the Navy before?" Sam considered his answer carefully. "Because who I was doesn't matter as much as who I am." "But it helped you save the shop." He nodded slowly. "It did. But the fight wasn't about me. It was about remembering that some places, some people, aren't meant to be erased." Emily leaned against his shoulder, small and certain. "I won't forget." Sam gently rested his hand over hers. "That's all I need." The judge who had once dismissed him sent a letter weeks later. No official header. No legal formality. Just a handwritten note. "I've presided over thousands of cases. I've forgotten most. I will not forget you." Sam folded the letter and tucked it inside the leather box with his dog tags. He didn't need to frame it. He didn't need to tell anyone he'd received it. Some acknowledgments are meant to be carried quietly, just like the man himself. As the seasons turned, the Sundays at the pier grew larger. What began as a simple habit, Sam sitting quietly on his bench with a cup of black coffee, became a silent invitation. First, it was the familiar veterans from Millstone. Then came those from neighboring towns. Soon, men and women who had traveled from other states began to appear. They didn't come with banners or speeches. They came with folding chairs, thermoses, and worn jackets bearing patches from places most people had forgotten. They gathered not to talk about war, not to recount the past in detail, but to sit, to share silence with someone who understood the weight they all carried. There was no formal organization, no schedules, no announcements, only the quiet rhythm of people remembering. Bear McKinney stood beside Sam one morning, watching as the pier slowly filled. "Did you ever think it would turn into this?" Sam's answer came slow, like the tide. "I didn't think it would matter to anyone else." Bear's low chuckle rumbled like distant thunder. "Sometimes it just takes one person to stand still long enough for the rest of us to catch up." Even the town council, once eager to pave over the waterfront, now supported its preservation. They installed new plaques along the docks, recognizing the veterans who had built and sustained the fishing community. But they left Sam's shop untouched, weathered, leaning, authentic. It remained exactly as it was meant to be. One particular Sunday, a group of active-duty Navy SEALs appeared at the pier. They approached Sam quietly, their uniforms crisp, their movements precise but respectful. They didn't introduce themselves with rank or title. They simply handed Sam a folded flag, signed by their unit. One of them, younger but with eyes that carried the same quiet weight, said, "We've heard about you, sir. About how you held your ground." Sam's grip tightened slightly on the flag, but he gave no grand response. Just a simple nod. The young SEAL hesitated. "I thought you'd be. I don't know." Louder. A faint smile touched Sam's lips. "Loud doesn't last. Presence does." The younger man understood. He didn't need further explanation. Emily watched the exchange from the shop window, her small fingers tracing the grain of the old wooden counter. To her, this was simply her grandfather's life unfolding, one filled with quiet people doing difficult things without asking for applause. That night, as Emily helped Sam close the shop, she pointed to the growing memory wall. "There's not much room left." Sam glanced at it, then returned to sweeping the floor. "Then we'll build another." She paused, watching him, then asked, "Grandpa, are you proud?" Sam rested on the broom handle, his gaze distant but steady. "I'm not sure pride's the right word, but I'm glad I stayed." The wind from the sea carried the faint smell of salt and old wood through the open door. And though the shop would always be small, the space it now occupied in people's hearts had become something vast. It was a quiet Wednesday when the past found its way back to Millstone. Sam was repairing one of the shop's fishing reels when the bell above the door chimed. He didn't look up right away. Most people now knew the shop was less about bait and more about presence. But something in the silence that followed the bell caught his attention. When he finally raised his eyes, he saw a man standing there, late 60s, tall, lean, with a weathered face that carried the sharp lines of memory. "Rourke," the man said softly, his voice rough with time. "It's been a long road." Sam set the reel down, his brow furrowing as recognition settled in. Commander Hayes, the man who had once led Sam's SEAL team, stood in the doorway, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable posture of command. His hair was silver now, his gait slower, but the weight he carried was unchanged. "Mind some company?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. Sam motioned to the bench near the window. As they sat, the years between them folded quietly away. Hayes glanced around the shop, taking in the memory wall, the rough shelves, the little girl's drawings pinned near the register. "I heard about what happened here. About the judge. About the way you stood your ground." Sam shrugged. "Did what I could." Hayes smirked faintly. "You always did. Even when no one else understood why." There was a long pause between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence built on shared history, the kind forged in places where words were often useless. "You were always the quiet one, Rourke," Hayes said, his voice softening. "Never chased medals. Never wanted to be seen." Sam leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting out toward the pier. "Some things aren't meant to be displayed. Some things you just carry." Hayes nodded. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, its edges worn from years of being unfolded and folded again. "I kept this," Hayes said, placing it on the table. "It's the mission roster from that day, the one where we lost 2 of our own." Sam's jaw tightened slightly, his thumb brushing along the tabletop. "I remember. You wrote something on the back. I never asked you about it." Sam carefully flipped the paper over. His own handwriting, faded but legible, stared back at him. "Hold your ground, even if you're the only one standing." "I wrote that after we set the perimeter," Sam murmured, the memory fresh despite the decades. "I didn't know anyone would keep it." Hayes offered a rare, genuine smile. "Some things are worth keeping." They sat in silence as the tide rolled in, the afternoon light cutting across the floor in long, golden bands. Hayes eventually stood, placing a hand on Sam's shoulder. A brief, firm grip that said everything words didn't need to. As he left, Emily appeared from the back, her head tilted curiously. "Who was that?" "Old friend," Sam said, his voice distant but warm. He looked like he'd been through a lot. Sam's faint smile returned. "We all have." And as the shop settled back into its rhythm, Sam folded the mission roster carefully and placed it on the memory wall, its place earned not by victory, but by the simple, quiet act of standing. The summer days in Millstone grew long and slow, wrapping the town in the soft hum of routine. Yet for Sam, each day now seemed to carry a quiet purpose. Emily had started asking more questions. Not the innocent curiosities of a child, but the deeper ones, the kind that reached places Sam had carefully packed away. One morning, as they walked along the shoreline, Emily finally asked what had lingered between them for weeks. "Grandpa, were you ever scared when you were a soldier?" Sam's step slowed. The question didn't surprise him, but the honesty of it, the weight with which she asked, it settled differently. He crouched to her level, his voice calm, not rehearsed. "Yeah," he admitted. "Plenty of times. But you didn't run away." His gaze drifted toward the sea, his eyes steady. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you stand your ground anyway. You hold it. Not for medals, not for stories, for the people beside you, for the ground beneath you." Emily thought about that as the waves lapped at their feet. When they returned to the shop, Sam began teaching her small things, not about weapons or tactics, but about paying attention. He showed her how to tie knots that wouldn't slip, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds, how to stand still long enough to hear the difference between a passing breeze and a storm building in the distance. Each lesson was wrapped in something larger, though he never said it outright. Claire noticed the changes, too. Emily had grown more thoughtful, more patient. She listened closely, not just to Sam, but to the way the world moved around her. One evening, Claire sat beside her father on the porch as the sun sank low. "You're preparing her for something, aren't you?" Sam's gaze stayed on the horizon. "I'm preparing her to stand." Claire leaned into the silence for a while before she spoke again. "You never wanted to be anyone's hero." "No," Sam said softly. "I just wanted to leave things a little stronger than I found them." In the weeks that followed, a letter arrived from the local high school. They had heard about Sam's story and invited him to speak at an upcoming Veterans Day assembly. Sam declined at first. Public speaking wasn't something he wanted, nor did he feel it necessary. But Emily insisted. "You should go, Grandpa," she said one evening, "so other people can remember too." Sam looked at her, the resolve in her small face almost a mirror of his own. Sometimes, we don't choose the moments that define us. Sometimes, the people we teach to stand are the ones who gently push us forward. And so, with quiet reluctance, Sam agreed. Not to be celebrated, but to remember. The school auditorium buzzed softly with anticipation. Rows upon rows of folding chairs were filled with students, teachers, parents, and community members. Veterans Day in Millstone had never felt quite this important before. Word had spread about Sam Rourke, the retired Navy SEAL who had quietly stood his ground to save his family's bait shop, and, with it, a piece of the town's soul. Some had come hoping to catch a glimpse of the man behind the story. Others simply wanted to honor a hero they never knew. Backstage, Sam adjusted his worn jacket. His hands, steady as ever, were folded loosely at his waist, but beneath his calm exterior, the steady rhythm of nerves pulsed in quiet beats. Years of discipline taught him to hold still in pressure, yet the weight of the moment was different now. This was not a battlefield of sand and shadows, but of young eyes watching, waiting for a lesson. Emily, his granddaughter, sat nearby with Claire, her mother. Emily's small fingers gripped Claire's hand tightly, her eyes wide and proud. Claire's own gaze was fixed on Sam, a mix of pride, worry, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. When his name was called, the room hushed. Sam stepped into the soft glow of the stage lights, and the sea of young faces met his gaze. He was no longer the quiet man in the back of the courtroom. Now he was a teacher of something harder to define. "I'm not here to tell stories of war," Sam began, his voice steady and measured. "Not to paint pictures of battles or medals. I'm here to talk about standing. About standing when it's hard, when no one is watching, and when the world seems ready to move on without you." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. His eyes scanned the room slowly, lingering on the faces of the students, so full of potential, yet so untested by life's hardest lessons. "There's something I learned early in my service," he continued. "It's not about being fearless. It's about standing your ground, even when fear is your closest companion. It's about holding the line, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because sometimes what you stand for is bigger than you are." He glanced toward Emily, who sat in the front row, her small frame leaning forward, eyes locked on his. "My fight wasn't just for me," he said softly. "It was for my family, for my community, for the memories and people who deserve to be remembered, for the places where stories live." From the back, a young student raised her hand hesitantly. When called on, she asked quietly, "How do you keep going when it feels like no one cares?" Sam looked toward her, the question simple but profound. "You don't do it for recognition," he answered, voice low and sincere. "You do it because you believe that some things, some people, are worth fighting for, even if it's just standing still." The applause that followed was slow at first, then grew steady and strong. It wasn't a roar. It was a shared understanding. Respect born not of spectacle, but of truth. After the assembly, a young teacher approached him, eyes shining. "Your story reminded us all," she said, "to pay attention, not just to history, but to the people in our communities who carry it." Sam nodded, feeling the quiet power of her words. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the hardest battles are the ones fought at home." That night, back at the shop, Emily wrapped her arms tightly around Sam's waist. "You did great, Grandpa," she said simply. Sam smiled down at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," he said, "we did. Because standing alone, in truth, is never standing alone. And sometimes, the most powerful victories are the quiet ones, the ones that inspire others to stand as well." The days that followed the Veterans Day assembly brought more than just passing applause and fleeting news stories. There was a subtle shift in Millstone, one that seeped slowly into the fabric of the town, felt in the nods of neighbors, the softened greetings from strangers, and the way people lingered a little longer on the pier. Sam returned to his bait shop with Emily and Claire at his side. The shop, weathered and worn, stood like a silent witness to decades of stories, sacrifices, and memories. But now, it carried a new kind of life, one fueled not by fish or commerce, but by respect and remembrance. Veterans who had once drifted quietly through town began to show themselves more openly. They gathered in small groups, sharing stories over steaming mugs of coffee, rekindling old friendships, and forging new bonds with townsfolk who, until recently, hadn't understood the depth beneath their silent presence. One afternoon, as the salty breeze drifted in from the harbor, Sam was sitting on the pier, repairing a frayed fishing net. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden planks. A young man approached, walking slowly but with purpose. "Mr. Rourke?" the young man asked, his voice carrying a mix of respect and uncertainty. Sam looked up, meeting the gaze of the youth before him. The man wore the insignia of the local ROTC unit, a symbol of promise, discipline, and commitment. "I just wanted to say thank you," the young man continued, hesitating slightly. "You inspired me, and a lot of others, to think differently about what service means, about standing up for something bigger than yourself, even when it's hard, even when no one is watching." Sam nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling deep. "That's all any of us can hope for," he said, voice low and steady. "To leave something worth standing for." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Sam settled back onto the bench outside the shop. Emily nestled against him, her small face calm and thoughtful. "Grandpa," she said softly, "will you ever stop fighting?" Sam's eyes drifted to the rippling water, his smile gentle but knowing. "Some fights never end," he said. "But not all battles are fought with fists or words. Sometimes, just standing your ground, quietly, steadily, is the greatest fight of all." Emily looked up at him, eyes wide and earnest. "I want to stand like that too." Sam wrapped his hand around hers, a quiet promise passing between them. "Then you will. And you'll do it even better." The legacy of Sam Rourke was no longer just his own. It was carried forward in the hearts of a town remembering, in the strength of a young girl learning what it means to hold firm, and in the quiet courage of a generation inspired by a man who fought without fanfare. Millstone would never forget the man who stood quietly against the storm. And Sam knew, deep in his bones, that the strongest battles were often fought in silence, with honor, with grace, and without a need for applause. The peaceful rhythm that had settled over Millstone was not immune to the shadows that often follow those who carry a heavy past. Like a faint but persistent echo, reminders of old battles and unresolved conflicts found their way back to Sam. One evening, after closing the shop later than usual, Sam walked inside beneath the dim glow of a street lamp. The cool night air was thick with silence. As he stepped across the threshold, his eyes caught something, a folded envelope, thin but firm, tucked just beneath the weathered door. He picked it up slowly, his fingers brushing over the coarse paper. No return address, no signature, just a single typed page, stark and cold against the fading light. The past isn't done with you, Rourke. You think standing your ground changes anything? Some debts never settle. Sam's breath caught, but his face remained unreadable. This was no ordinary threat. It was a reminder, one that those who had walked dangerous paths learned to recognize. The subtle warning sent to men who had once operated in shadows, whose lives had intersected with enemies both seen and unseen. Just then, Claire arrived, concern flickering across her face as she noticed the note in his hand. "Threats?" she asked softly, voice low but sharp with worry. Sam folded the paper carefully and looked up, steady but weighed down by the gravity of the message. "Old ghosts," he said quietly. "Sometimes the past reminds you it's still there, waiting." That night, Sam's sleep was restless. His dreams flickered with memories long buried. Harsh deserts, distant mountains, and the faces of men lost to time and circumstance. Decisions made in fractions of a second. Missions that could never be shared. But threading through it all was an unbroken resolve, a promise to stand no matter what. At dawn, before the sun had fully risen, Bear McKinney pulled up in his truck. He carried the kind of quiet urgency that only veterans know, the weight of understanding that a fight, even a quiet one, was coming. They sat together on the porch, the silence between them thick but purposeful. "We need to be ready," Bear said simply. "If they want to push, we push back. But on our terms, with precision and control, not reckless force." Sam's eyes hardened, the faint spark of tactical fire lighting within. "Not with fists," he replied firmly. "With presence. With truth. We don't have to escalate. We just have to hold." Around them, the community stirred, the veterans who had stood by Sam, the townsfolk who had come to understand what that shop truly represented. They would stand too, not out of anger or revenge, but because some lines were never meant to be crossed. The quiet fight, the one fought with honor, discipline, and unyielding strength, was far from over. And Sam was ready. The days that followed carried a tense, almost electric calm, a quiet stillness that felt like the ocean holding its breath before a storm breaks. Sam moved through Millstone with the same steady grace and quiet dignity he always had, but behind his calm eyes lay the sharp edge of vigilance. Every look, every measured step, betrayed a mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. He met often with Bear McKinney and a small group of trusted veterans. They gathered in the back room of the bait shop, a place once filled with nothing more than fishing gear and faded photographs. Now, it was a command center of sorts, filled with maps, notes, and strategies. But these plans were never about confrontation through violence. Instead, they focused on resilience, how to hold the line without crossing it, how to protect the shop, the people, and the spirit of their community. They discussed who would keep watch during the quiet hours, how to alert neighbors without alarming them, and ways to share responsibility so no one stood alone. Every detail was deliberate, practiced with the precision of a mission briefing. Theirs was a mission to preserve, not to provoke. Claire noticed the subtle changes in her father. His silences deepened, his gaze often drifted beyond the horizon, as if reading threats invisible to others. Yet Emily, with her youthful innocence and quiet determination, remained the tether that kept him grounded. Her laughter, her questions, her simple need for presence reminded Sam what was truly at stake. One afternoon, while tightening a loose board on the dock, Sam's thoughts drifted to the long road he had traveled, the distant deserts and mountain ridges where battles were fought with guns and grit, the quiet courtroom battle that saved the bait shop. And now, this looming challenge lurking like a shadow waiting to pounce. A soft breeze stirred the small weathered flags Emily had planted around the shop, their gentle fluttering a quiet anthem of endurance and hope. Sam's hand brushed over the dog tags resting beneath his shirt, a weight both physical and spiritual, a reminder of battles past and the strength still within. He reflected on the lessons learned over decades. True strength was not measured by fury or brute force. It was found in control, in discipline, in the presence of mind to hold steady amid uncertainty. It was in knowing when to act, and, just as importantly, when to wait. The night before the first confrontation, Sam stood alone on the pier, staring out into the dark water. The lights of Millstone twinkled behind him like distant stars brought down to earth. The world felt still, but Sam's breath was steady, his nerves honed by years of silent preparation. This was not his first fight, nor would it be his last. But this one, the battle to protect what he held dear, he intended to win. Not with violence, but with honor, with presence, and with unwavering resolve. Because sometimes, the greatest battles are fought in silence, carried out not with weapons or words, but with the quiet power of steadfastness. The morning broke clear and cold, with a thin layer of mist still hanging low over the water. Sam arrived early at the bait shop, moving with practiced calm. The town was still waking up, but beneath the surface, the tension simmered. Bear joined him shortly after, bringing coffee and a steady presence. They didn't speak much, no need. Their shared history was enough. Together, they inspected the shop and the surrounding pier, checking for anything out of place. Signs of surveillance, unusual footprints, anything that might signal the approach of trouble. As the sun climbed, a few familiar faces appeared. Neighbors, fellow veterans, even a handful of townsfolk who had come to stand quietly with them. No banners, no slogans, just a circle of support that felt solid and unshakable. The day passed in a series of small moments. A shared meal, conversations low and careful, eyes always watching but never flinching. The threat was invisible, but its presence was heavy, like a shadow stretching across the town. Then, in mid-afternoon, the first move came. A group of suited men arrived, representatives from the developer's company, accompanied by legal aides. They approached the shop with confident steps and thin smiles, expecting to intimidate. Sam met them at the door, his gaze steady but without anger. "This place isn't for sale," he said simply. One of the men smirked, producing papers and contracts, clearly expecting to bully their way through. But Sam's quiet strength was impenetrable. He did not shout. He did not threaten. Instead, he stood firm, his presence alone a line they could not cross. Behind him, the circle of support grew tighter, a living barrier made of respect and determination. The men left eventually, their smiles gone, their arrogance replaced with the realization that this was no ordinary fight. That evening, as the sun set and the town settled again, Sam stood on the pier with Emily and Claire. The battle had only just begun, but already, the quiet strength of a community ready to stand was clear. Sometimes, the fiercest fights are those won with silent resolve. The final days unfolded with a quiet dignity that matched the man at their center. The developer's company, once brash and full of certainty, found their confidence slipping away. No amount of money or legal maneuvering could break the wall of unwavering resolve standing firm in Millstone. Sam Rourke's presence wasn't just a symbol, it was a movement. A quiet rebellion rooted in honor, history, and community. Across town, local businesses banded together, refusing to sell out or cooperate with the developer's efforts. Petitions circulated, letters poured in from veterans and neighbors alike, all reminding the world that some legacies could not be bought or erased. The once threatened bait shop became a gathering place, a beacon of steadfastness where stories were shared and respect was quietly renewed. Sam's shop, weathered by time and trials, had become something larger than itself, a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. One crisp afternoon, the unexpected happened. The judge who had publicly humiliated Sam months before appeared quietly at the pier. Gone was the courtroom posture and thin veneer of authority. Instead, there was a man weathered by time and reflection, carrying the humility of one who had witnessed truth and grown from it. He approached Sam slowly, extending a hand with sincerity. "Mr. Rourke," he said, his voice steady but soft, "I owe you an apology. You stood with honor where I once failed to see it." Sam accepted the handshake, the moment heavy with unspoken years of pain, misunderstanding, and respect. No words were necessary beyond that gesture. It was a quiet reconciliation between two men who had walked very different paths, but now met on equal ground. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Sam sat beside Emily on the worn bench outside the shop. The air was thick with the calm after the storm. "We stood," Sam said softly, eyes reflecting the fading light. Emily smiled up at him, her small hand finding his. "Together." Sam looked out across the pier. The same pier where battles had been fought, not with weapons, but with presence, honor, and silent strength. Here, the fight was won not by loud victories or grand gestures, but by the steady courage of a man who refused to be erased. In that moment, there was no need for applause or accolades. The victory belonged not just to Sam, but to every quiet soul who had stood beside him. The fight was over. The legacy was secured, and a retired Navy SEAL stood tall, finally recognized not for the medals he wore, but for the unwavering strength he carried within. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.